Captain Elias Kane gripped the periscope handles in the command sphere of the abyss runner Eidolon, his knuckles whitening against the worn leather wraps. The submarine's hull hummed with the restrained fury of its fusion turbines, holding position at 4,000 meters beneath the Pacific's obsidian surface. Outside, the pressure was a constant 25,000 tons per square inch, a weight that would pulverize any surface vessel, alien or human, into vapor. But here, in the eternal night of the oceanic trenches, humanity had found sanctuary. 2 decades earlier, the Vorath Dominion had descended upon Earth in a storm of kinetic lances and gravitic warheads. Their armada's sleek, kilometer-long bastions of alloy and plasma had shattered orbital defenses in hours, neutralized every major military installation in days, and claimed these surface continents within a year. Cities burned, skies filled with their angular interceptors, and the remnants of human governments broadcast unconditional surrender from bunkers beneath the Rockies. The Vorath, a species of towering, exoskeletal pragmatists evolved on a high-gravity world of stratified hive cities, saw the submission as logical. Earth was theirs, but the ocean's 97% of the planet's habitable volume remained untouched. The Vorath dismissed them as a hostile wilderness. Their physiology could not withstand prolonged submersion. Their ships, optimized for vacuum and atmospheric dominance, crumpled under the embrace of the deep. Surface convoys plied the seas for resource extraction, but no Vorath ever descended below 500 meters. The abyssal trenches, those jagged wounds in the planet's crust, were mapped in hasty sonar sweeps and promptly abandoned. They called it the Undervoid, irrelevant, unconquerable. Elias Kane knew better. He had been 28 when the occupation began, a civilian oceanographer charting the Mariana Trench for private submersible expeditions. When the skies fell, he watched from the cramped pilot house of the research vessel Hydra, as Vorath dreadnoughts tore through the Pacific Fleet like paper through a shredder. Thousands died in the first volleys, ships vanishing in geysers of steam and debris. Elias survived by submerging the Hydra to its crush depth and riding the shockwaves down into the trench, where the enemy could not follow. That descent lasted 18 hours. When he surfaced 2 weeks later, the surface world belonged to the VORATH. In the years that followed, the desperate remnants of humanity fled into the deep. Submarines, research vessels, and civilian submersibles were retrofitted into a nomadic fleet. Entire populations, 2 million souls, scattered across 100 hulls, took up residence in the trenches. They transformed the ocean floor into a moving empire, mobile habitats grafted onto the hulls of Leviathan-class abyss runners, each a self-sustaining city capable of traversing the planet's underbelly at flank speed. Hydrothermal vents became forges. Methane clathrates fueled reactors. Bioluminescent extremophiles illuminated the labyrinthine corridors of the deep-sea colonies. Elias rose through the ranks not by birthright or politics, but by necessity. He understood the deep in a way no admiral ever had. It was not a void to be conquered, but a domain to be inhabited, like a parasite riding the flesh of a greater beast. Now at 48, he commanded the Pacific Undersea Resistance, a fleet of 42 runners operating from the Challenger Deep, his face, scarred from a hull breach that claimed his left eye, was a map of survival, salt-streaked hair cropped short, skin perpetually pale from a lifetime without sunlight, and a gaze that carried the weight of decisions made in darkness. In the command sphere. Elias lowered the periscope and turned to his executive officer, Lieutenant Rao, a wiry woman from the submerged slums of Mumbai who had welded her first hull patch at 13. Surface convoy inbound. 8 freighters, 4 escorts. Standard dispersal pattern. Rao studied the holographic bathysphere plot, where green wireframes represented the Vorath ships gliding across the thermocline. They're fat with ore from the Andes refineries. No depth charges, no hunter-killers in the screen. They still think we're drowned ghosts. Ghosts that bite, Elias said. He did not smile. There was little room for levity in a war waged by ambush and evasion. The resistance had been striking for 8 years quick, brutal raids that tore the bellies out of convoys and vanished before retaliation could penetrate the depths. Each hit yielded cargoes of irreplaceable surface-manufactured components, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, rare earths that could not yet be replicated in the abyssal foundries. But the raids were surgical. Never enough to provoke a total commitment of Vorath naval resources, which remained fixated on suppressing the scattered surface insurgencies. Yet Elias felt the strain like barnacles on a hull. His fleet was a patchwork of miracles, hulls patched with composites extruded from seafloor silicates, crews sustained on vat-grown protein and hydroponic algae. Every sortie risked catastrophic implosion. And there was the unspoken rot within, doubt. Not all survivors embraced the deep. Some whispered of negotiating surrender, of emerging from the trenches to beg clemency from the overlords. Elias had quelled 3 mutinies personally, each time sparing the ringleaders not out of mercy, but because execution wasted manpower. Still, the question gnawed at him in the small hours, when the hull's creaks mimicked the voices of the dead. Was survival enough? Or were they merely delaying the inevitable, preserving humanity as a captive species in an endless night? The decision came without preamble. A convoy this laden could not be ignored. It carried the neural lattice arrays needed to expand the fleet's command network. Elias activated the general circuit. All hands, this is Cain. We are going to war. The Eidolon and its sister runner's nemesis. Abyssal Crown and Leviathan's Fang slipped from their berths in the trench wall, propelled by magnetoplasma drives that left no thermal signature. They ascended through layers of stratified water, ghosts in a world of pressure and darkness. At 2,000 meters, Elias watched the bathyplot fill with the convoy's acoustic shadow, the freighters lumbering at 20 knots, their escorts sweeping futilely with active sonar. Then, the first strike. Nemesis unleashed a salvo of super-cavitating torpedoes missiles that rode bubbles of vapor to velocities exceeding Mach 8 in water. The weapons burrowed through the convoy's lower hulls like drill-tipped lances, detonating not with brute force, but with shaped charges that severed structural spines. 3 freighters broke apart in cascades of venting atmosphere, their debris fields blooming like metallic krill swarms. Panic rippled through the Vorath formation. Escorts fired omnidirectional spreads of hunter torpedoes, but the resistance vessels were already gone, diving back into the cold compress of the depths. Elias monitored the escape from the command sphere, counting the seconds until the enemy weapons lost acquisition in the acoustic clutter of the trench. The freighter's cargoes tumbled through the water column, sealed pallets of crystalline matrices, tumbling like manna into the waiting grapples of submersible tenders. It was victory, small and savage. But as the Eidolon settled into its berth amid the trench's labyrinth of basalt spires, Elias stood alone in the observation blister, staring into the phosphorescent void. The raid had yielded enough lattice arrays to link 10 more runners into the fleet's neural net, but at the cost of 16 dead 6 from a near miss that buckled a secondary pressure hull. He pressed his palm against the 5-inch thick acrylic, feeling the faint vibration of the ocean's eternal pulse. In that moment, doubt sharpened into clarity. Survival was not enough. The Vorath owned the air and the soil, but the deep was humanity's birthright, the primordial womb from which all life had crawled. They had not conquered it because they could not comprehend it, a realm where pressure forged diamonds from carbon filth, where life thrived in darkness absolute. Elias had seen men pray in the moments before a hull breach, murmuring words to a god they could not see, and emerge alive against all probability. Not luck, they said, purpose. The surface would be reclaimed. Not by storming the beaches, but by rising from the sea itself, and in the lightless trenches. Where no Vorath eye could see, the deep began to stir. Captain Elias Kane stood in the narrow passage between the Idolais engineering bays, the air thick with the acrid tang of lubricant and ionized plasma. The bulkheads thrummed with the labor of repair crews welding fresh plates over the fractured secondary hull, sparks cascading like brief, angry stars in the dim red light. 16 dead from the last raid. Their bodies had been sealed in titanium sarcophagi and committed to the trench, marked only by data tags in the fleet's austere memorial archive. No fanfare, no gravesites to mourn over. In the deep, permanence was an illusion. Lieutenant Rao approached, her boots clanging against the deck plates. She handed him a data slate displaying the inventory from the captured freighters, 37 intact neural lattice arrays, enough to synchronize the fleet's command network across 2,000 kilometers of ocean. It was a prize that would allow the runners to coordinate strikes with the precision of a single mind. But her expression carried no triumph. "Casualties are hitting morale," she said flatly. "Deck 14's crew is refusing to seal up the patch until we get a full diagnostic on the hull stress. They're saying it's a death trap waiting to rupture." Elias studied the schematics on the slate. The fracture had spiderwebbed through 3 meters of composite laminate, a hairline that could propagate under repeated dives. The crew's fear was rational. He had felt the same dread in his bones during his first submersion, the certainty that the ocean would claim him in an instant of silent annihilation. But rationality had no place in a war where every voyage was a gamble against implosion. "They'll seal it," he said. "Or they can transfer to the auxiliary tenders and spend the rest of their lives harvesting krill. Tell them the choice is theirs." Rao's eyes narrowed. "That's not leadership, Captain. It's coercion. They're not cowards. They're survivors who've seen what happens when a hull fails." The words struck deeper than she knew. Elias had seen it 27 years prior aboard the runner Tartarus. A torpedo graze had compromised the forward pressure sphere, and the resulting cascade failure consumed the vessel in under 30 seconds. 612 men and women, gone without a scream, reduced to a debris field of ruptured cells and twisted girders. He had pulled the abort command too late, and the ghosts of that delay still shadowed his decisions. "I'm not asking them to die," he replied, his voice low and deliberate. "I'm asking them to live long enough to bury the Vorath. If they want certainty, they should have stayed on the surface and knelt." Rao held his gaze for a moment, then nodded and departed. Elias remained in the passage, the clamor of repair work filling the silence. The truth she had voiced gnawed at him. The fleet was holding together with welds and willpower, but every raid widened the fissures, both in hulls and in the human spirit. Some crews whispered that the deep was a tomb, that humanity's only hope lay in submission, in emerging from hiding to barter for existence under Vorath rule. Others clung to the belief that the ocean was their salvation, a realm where the enemy's dominance could never reach. Elias stood between those convictions, pulled by the weight of command. 2 days later, the fleet received its first indication that the Vorath were beginning to reconsider the undervoid. A captured short-range interceptor drone, snared in a towed acoustic net, yielded fragmented data bursts, orders for a new class of deep-water probes, autonomous machines designed to map and dominate the trenches. The Vorath, it seemed, had finally recognized the attrition inflicted by the submarine raiders and were seeking a response. In the command sphere, Elias convened his senior captains via compressed data type beam. The holographic projections flickered with grainy resolution, each face etched with the pallor of perpetual night. Commander Javier Ruiz of the Nemesis, a former submarine warfare specialist with a voice like grinding gravel, was the first to speak. "They're sending probes, not ships," Ruiz said. "It's a scouting action. They want to know what's down here before they commit their navy." "They'll find wreckage, ghost signatures, and empty trenches," Elias replied. "But they'll also find us eventually." If they develop weapons that can operate at full ocean depth, our advantage evaporates. Then we destroy the probes as they come, Ruiz countered. Every one we kill buys us time. And every kill tells them exactly where to look, interjected Commander Lena Voss of the Leviathan's Fang. Her tone was measured, clinical. They'll refine their designs, increase the numbers, narrow the search parameters. We can't fight an attritional war against their production capacity. The debate circled like a school of predators in a confined volume. Elias listened, weighing the arguments. The fleet could evade indefinitely, striking and vanishing into the labyrinth of the trenches. But evasion was stagnation. The surface remained under alien control, its populations conscripted into labor pools or confined to fortified preserves. Every year spent in hiding weakened the resistance. While the Vorath consolidated their grip on the planet's landmasses, the decision crystallized in a moment of stark clarity. We stop hiding, Elias said. We turned their probes into teachers. The plan was audacious, even by the standards of a fleet that lived at the edge of annihilation. Select runners would shadow each Vorath probe deployment, allowing the machines to penetrate the trenches, but only so far. At predetermined depths, precisely coordinated ambushes would destroy the intruders, their sensor logs and final transmissions captured intact. The fleet's cryptographers would dissect the data, learning the limits of Vorath deep-water technology, their acoustic propagation models, their pressure-resistant materials, their countermeasures. The enemy would be forced to reveal the boundaries of their ignorance, and humanity would exploit every flaw. The first test came a month later. A Vorath probe cluster 12 teardrop-shaped machines, each the size of a destroyer, descended into the Peru-Chile Trench. The fleet tracked their approach through a web of passive hydrophones strung across the seafloor like the nerves of some colossal beast. Elias commanded the operation from the Igelen, riding at the ragged edge of crushed depth as the probes filtered through the trench mouth, their active sonar painting the darkness with false echoes. For 12 hours, the resistance held its breath, allowing the machines to plunge into the depths. The probes were formidable, hulls of isotropic carbon composites reinforced with self-healing polymers, drives that neutralized cavitation noise, sensor suites capable of resolving a single hull fracture at 10 kilometers. But they were not flawless. Their thermal management systems vented excess heat in discrete pulses, creating transient shadows that the fleet's older, less efficient submarines could exploit. At the nadir of their descent, the trap closed. 24 runners emerged from alcoves and thermal vents, their torpedoes synchronized to within microseconds. The probes fought with programmed ferocity, deploying decoy swarms and anti-torpedo grids, but the geometry of the trenches favored the attackers. 11 were destroyed outright, their ruptured cores spilling data cores and fragmented processors into the waiting nets. The 12th self-destructed, taking the corner of Abyssal Crown's forward array with it. The haul was unprecedented. Within 48 hours, the fleet's analysts had unraveled the probe's design limitations, a reliance on high-frequency sonar that failed beyond 7,000 meters, thermal blooms that betrayed their position to passive detectors, and navigation algorithms optimized for open water rather than the fractal chaos of trench interiors. More importantly, the captured transmissions revealed the Vorath command structure's growing frustration. The Undervoid was not merely inaccessible. It was actively hostile to their machines, a realm where their precision and scale became liabilities. Elias stood in the cryptanalysis chamber, surrounded by walls of scrolling code and the faint hum of decryption rigs. For the first time in years, he felt the stirrings of momentum. But as he watched the analysts strip the enemy's secrets bare, a quiet voice spoke in the silence of his thoughts. Knowledge was a double-edged blade. Every probe they dissected brought the Vorath closer to understanding the true scale of the threat that dwelled below. And when that understanding came, the deep would no longer be a sanctuary. The dissected remains of the Vorath. Probes littered the Eidolon's fabrication bays like the entrails of gutted leviathans. Data cores, their crystalline matrices cracked but salvageable, were pried from armored casings and fed into arrays of quantum decryptors. The work was relentless. Technicians worked in rotating shifts, their faces illuminated by the cold blue flicker of diagnostic terminals, coaxing terabytes of encrypted telemetry from the machines that had been designed to map and conquer the deep. Captain Elias Kane moved through the bays, observing the quiet frenzy. The intelligence harvest was staggering. The probes had carried detailed models of oceanic acoustics algorithms that assumed a predictable gradient of sound velocity. Blind to the chaotic refraction caused by microthermal layers and suspended particulate clouds. Their structural tolerances, though impressive, faltered under the sustained compressive loading of abyssal depths. Self-healing polymers could repair fissures, but only until the cumulative strain exceeded a critical threshold, after which the hulls catastrophically unzipped. These were not flaws of inferior engineering, but of fundamental incompatibility. The Vorath had built machines for an ocean. They could never inhabit. Yet victory carried its own weight. The fleet's cryptographers uncovered a directive buried in the probe command protocols. Each successive deployment was to increase in scale and sophistication, with explicit orders to locate and neutralize the anomalous subsurface predators. The Vorath were no longer content with reconnaissance. They were preparing to wage war upon the depths. The first escalation arrived unannounced, shattering the fragile equilibrium of ambush and evasion. A Vorath task force, 6 heavy freighters escorted by a dozen deep-water corvettes, descended into the Tonga Trench, towing a constellation of tethered sensor buoys and unmanned hunter platforms. Unlike the solitary probe clusters, this formation was a coordinated offensive. The corvettes, squat and brutally engineered with multi-layered pressure spheres, were the first vessels of their kind capable of sustained operations below 3,000 meters. Their towed arrays swept the water column with low-frequency active sonar, pulsing in overlapping grids that defied the traditional clutter of trench walls. Elias commanded the counterstrike from the Eidolon, coordinating 19 runners in a maneuver known as a fractal dispersal. The fleet fragmented into independent cells, each slipping through narrow submarine canyons and using the ocean's own acoustic shadows to mask their presence. It was a tactic born of desperation and intimate knowledge of the deep. The trenches were not merely hiding places, but weapons in their own right. Their convoluted geometry scattering and attenuating sonar returns, until the enemy's sensors drowned in false contacts. The engagement unfolded in stuttering bursts of violence. Hunter platforms, released from the corvettes, pursued phantom signatures into dead-end fissures, where they were obliterated by precisely placed limpet mines. Runner packs surged from concealed vents to rake the flanks of the freighters, their torpedoes exploiting the formation's elongated profile. 3 corvettes succumbed within the first hour, their pressure spheres rupturing in a chain of implosions that reverberated through the trench like the tolling of submerged bells. Debris rained into the depths, a metallic blizzard that further confused the surviving escorts, but the cost was merciless. The corvettes fought with a tenacity that bordered on self-annihilation. One crippled vessel, its forward sphere holed and venting cryogenic coolant, detonated its entire payload of hunter torpedoes in a spherical blast that propagated through the water with the force of a tactical nuclear strike. The pressure wave caught the Leviathan's fang broadside, compressing its outer hull and shearing away an entire engineering module. 387 crew members were lost in the instantaneous collapse, their deaths marked by a single, thunderous acoustic event that every hydrophone in the fleet recorded. Elias felt the loss as a physical blow, transmitted through the hull as a shuddering compression wave. He stood motionless in the command sphere, watching the bathyplot register the expanding debris field where a sister ship had existed moments before. The surviving runners withdrew, dragging salvage from the wreckage, but the victory was hollow. For the first time, the Vorath had brought the battle into the deep, and they had drawn blood in the aftermath. Elias faced the fracture that had been widening within his fleet. Commander Vos, sole survivor of Leviathan's Fang's command cadre, confronted him in the officer's ward. Her face was gaunt, streaked with the chemical residue of emergency repressurization, and her voice carried the ragged edge of grief, transformed into accusation. "We can't win this way," she said. "Every time we rise to meet them, they learn how to follow us down. We're teaching them to kill us in our own home. And if we do nothing," Elias countered, "they will flood the trenches with probes, platforms, and whatever follows. They will choke every canyon and vent until there is nowhere left to run." Voss shook her head. "Running is surviving. There are children aboard these runners' generations who have never seen the sun. If we fight until the last hull breaches, what are we preserving? A legend of defiance that ends in silence?" The question echoed the doubts Elias had buried beneath the necessity of command. He had ordered men and women into depths where survival depended on margins of error measured in millimeters, where a single microfracture could erase 1,000 lives. Was it strategy, or simply the momentum of refusal to submit? In the quiet moments, when the turbines idled and the ocean pressed against the hull, he found himself staring at the bulkheads, wondering if the God invoked in desperate prayers was listening, or if humanity's exile in the abyss was simply the natural consequence of a world too vast to be held. Yet surrender was not in his nature, nor in the nature of those who had chosen the deep. The following week, Elias ordered the fleet's fabrication yards to accelerate production of a new weapon, the Mauler-class abyssal torpedo. Larger than any predecessor, these weapons were not precision-guided missiles, but autonomous siege engines. Launched in coordinated salvos, they burrowed into trench walls, detonating in precisely sequenced cascades that induced controlled rockfalls and underwater landslides. The objective was not to destroy enemy vessels outright, but to bury them under millions of tons of fractured seabed. The first deployment came against a second Vorath incursion. A reinforced probe swarm backed by 20 corvettes and a command platform suspended at the trench's rim. As the enemy descended, Elias unleashed the maulers. The explosions did not register as discrete blasts but as a prolonged seismic event, a rumbling requiem that shook the entire length of the Tonga Trench. Fault lines, weakened over millennia by tectonic strain, gave way in a cataclysm of collapsing basalt. 12 corvettes vanished beneath avalanches of stone and sediment, their sensor feeds cut off mid-transmission. The command platform, caught in the periphery of the collapse, was pinned against the trench wall, its drives crushed beyond repair. The Vorath withdrew, leaving behind a graveyard of immobilized wrecks. But as the fleet salvaged what it could from the rubble, Elias stood in the observation blister, watching the turbid clouds of pulverized rock drift through the external floods. The maulers had proven devastatingly effective, transforming the geological instability of the deep into a weapon of mass denial. Yet the tactic carried an inescapable truth. Every landslide scarred the trenches, narrowing the labyrinth that had sheltered humanity for 2 decades. They were burning their refuge to keep it free. And in doing so, they were forcing the Vorath to confront a fundamental dilemma. To pursue their elusive foe was to invite annihilation within a domain that obeyed no external command. But Elias knew the reprieve would not last. The enemy would adapt, as they always did. And when they came again, they would bring weapons designed not merely to explore the deep, but to shatter it entirely. The Tonga Trench lay wounded. Vast scarps of pulverized basalt and mobilized sediment choked the narrower canyons, transforming passages that had once served as escape corridors into labyrinthine traps. The Mauler strikes had bought the fleet a measure of breathing room, entombing half a Vorath incursion beneath unrelenting tons of fractured seabed. But the cost was etched into the very geometry of humanity's sanctuary. Sonar charts required constant revision as debris flows continued to shift. Unpredictable even to those who had spent their lives navigating the deep's capricious currents. Captain Elias Kane stood in the midst of this altered terrain. Aboard the salvage tender Resolute, directing the recovery of the pinned Vorath command platform. The wreck clung to the trench wall like a mortally wounded beast, its kilometer-long hull warped by compressive forces that no surface-designed structure could withstand. Recovery teams and armored submersibles worked in the debris-choked darkness, severing data conduits and extracting core modules from compartments that had imploded with near-surgical violence. What they recovered was a revelation and a warning. The platform's primary archive, partially preserved within a tertiary pressure sphere, contained operational schematics for Project Umbral Reach, a coordinated assault doctrine intended to permanently deny the oceanic trenches to subsurface forces. Rather than attempting to match the fleet's mobility, the Vorath planned to systematically collapse the major abyssal features, New Britain, Peru, Chile, Mariana, using arrays of seabed penetrators. These weapons would detonate in precisely calculated sequences, triggering cascading tectonic failures that would bury the trenches under their own mass. The undervoid would be rendered uninhabitable, forcing the raiders to the surface, where they could be systematically eradicated. Elias studied the decrypted schematics in the Eidolon's cryptanalysis chamber, the holographic projections casting stark shadows across his face. The plan was brutally pragmatic, a solution born from an understanding that direct conquest of the deep was impossible. The Vorath did not need to occupy the trenches. They needed only to ensure that nothing else could. "We cannot let them execute this," Commander Ruiz said, his gravelly voice taut with controlled fury. "Every penetrator they emplace is another fracture line in our home. And if we destroy their emplacements, we confirm their suspicions," Voss countered. "They already know we exist. Every engagement gives them more data to perfect their collapse protocols." The Council of Captains debated in a chamber heavy with the scent of recirculated air and machine oil. Elias listened as arguments circled between annihilation and acquiescence, each voice tempered by the knowledge that the fleet's existence now hung on a narrowing margin of maneuverability. The Mauler strikes had demonstrated humanity's ability to weaponize the trenches against intrusion, but the Vorath response revealed a deeper truth. They were willing to wage a war of mutual destruction. In the silence following the debate, Elias made his decision. "We take the fight to their construction sites. But we do not merely destroy, we subvert." The strategy was as ruthless as it was precise. Intercept teams would infiltrate Vorath emplacements during the initial deployment phase, when security was lightest and the penetrators remained inert. Rather than detonating the weapons, saboteurs would tamper with their seismic trigger arrays reprogramming the synchronized firing sequences to induce failure cascades within the Vorath formation itself. An enemy attempting to bury the trenches would instead fracture their own staging areas, creating impassable barriers that denied them access to the very battlefield they sought to obliterate. The first operation targeted a Vorath supply convoy en route to the Kermadec Trench, carrying the initial cadre of penetrator launchers. The fleet struck under conditions of near-total acoustic blackout, using a combination of towed noisemakers and chemical dispersal pods to create a false debris field that masked the approach of 12 runners. Submersibles infiltrated the convoy's wake, attaching parasitic boarding drones to the undersides of the launcher transports. These machines burrowed through outer hulls, deploying teams of infiltrators clad in pressure-resistant exosuits. Elias led the primary insertion team, navigating the ruptured compartments of a transport vessel that still hummed with the desperate efforts of its automated damage control systems. The interior was a surreal tableau of alien engineering, conduits of translucent hyperdense fluid pulsing through latticework frames, crystalline memory cores embedded in walls of self-repairing foam, The infiltrators moved in silence, guided by stolen acoustic maps. Until they reached the penetrator magazine, the devices were monoliths of restrained, violent slender cylinders 40 meters in length, each containing a multi-stage shaped charge capable of excavating a cubic kilometer of bedrock. Alias's team severed the physical interlocks and uploaded a software contaminant disguised as a routine diagnostic update. The altered programming would allow remote command of the firing sequence, transforming the penetrators from instruments of Vorath supremacy into dormant Trojan horses. The withdrawal was flawless. The convoy continued to its destination, oblivious to the infection coiled within its cargo. 3 days later, as additional support vessels arrived to commence emplacement, Elias transmitted the activation code. 37 penetrators detonated in a precisely choreographed cascade, none within the trenches, but along the faulted rim of the Kermadec's primary access canyon. The resulting collapse sealed a 200-kilometer length of the primary approach route beneath 1 million tons of mobilized sediment. Vorath corvettes and tenders caught in the slide were crushed or hopelessly immobilized. Their transmissions choked off. By the acoustic chaos of unrelenting rock falls out, the fleet salvaged what it could from the wreckage and vanished into the fractured dark. For the first time, the Vorath recoiled from the deep, their planned deployment aborted. But victory carried a shadow that followed Elias back to the Eidolon. During the insertion, a boarding drone malfunctioned, trapping an entire fire team within a collapsing maintenance shaft. 12 technicians, among them a young systems engineer who had reprogrammed the fleet's first captured probe, were lost to a cascade of imploding bulkheads. Their deaths were swift, but no less corrosive for their efficiency. That night, alone in his cabin, Elias removed the pressure equalization collar from his neck and stared at the network of surgical scars beneath it. The collar was a relic of the Tartarus disaster, implanted to allow him to manually equalize his sinuses against catastrophic decompression. It had saved his life once, but it served as a constant reminder of the lives it had failed to preserve. He had ordered the boarding action knowing the risks, had sent men and women into the belly of an enemy vessel that could implode at any moment. Was this the measure of defiance, or simply the incremental expenditure of those under his command? He crossed to the small observation port, where the faint glow of chemosynthetic bacteria painted the trench wall in ghostly strokes. In that unyielding darkness, he spoke aloud, the words barely audible over the ceaseless thrum of the hull. If there is order in this, some design beyond the random breaking of stone and bone, then let it be shown. Because I cannot tell the difference. The answer did not come in voices or visions, but in the continued silence of survival. The fleet endured, and the Vorath advance faltered. Yet Elias knew the enemy would not be deterred indefinitely. Subversion could only delay the inevitable. The penetrators were a symptom of a larger shift. The Vorath were beginning to comprehend that the deep was not merely a tactical nuisance, but a sovereign domain, one that required eradication rather than subjugaon. As the fleet dispersed into the scarred and shifting trenches, Elias understood that the next phase of the war would demand more than sabotage. To preserve the ocean as humanity's bastion, they would have to convince the Vorath that any attempt to destroy it would cost more than they could afford to lose, and that conviction could only be forged in the crucible of a battle that neither side could escape. The sabotaged collapse in the Kermadec Trench marked a fracture in the Vorath calculus. For 7 months, their deep-water expedition ceased entirely. Sensor buoys went unanswered, probe clusters hung inert in the upper reaches of the trenches, and the scattered corvettes that survived the rockfalls retreated to the shallows, their hulls battered and their operational envelopes permanently reduced. The ocean floor, scarred but unbowed, remained a realm of uninterrupted silence, patrolled only by the nomadic runners of the Pacific Undersea Resistance. Captain Elias Kane understood that this respite was not surrender, but preparation. The Vorath were a species forged in the unyielding stratification of their homeworld's megastructures, where failure was met with systematic elimination rather than retreat. They would return, armed with a doctrine calibrated to the lessons of subversion and annihilation. That doctrine arrived without preamble. Acoustic intercepts from compromised Vorath logistics networks revealed the deployment of the Nader assault groups, self-contained, autonomous battle clusters designed not to occupy the deep, but to render it uninhabitable. Each group consisted of 64 penetrator platforms, vast, unmanned cylinders propelled by inertial mass drivers, interlinked by a distributed command lattice. Once emplaced along a trench's primary axis, the platforms would detonate in a precisely phased sequence, exploiting the mechanical coupling of tectonic faults to propagate a self-sustaining chain of collapses. A single Nader assault group could bury an entire trench system beneath its own pulverized mass, creating a permanent exclusion zone from which no submarine could emerge. The fleet's response was immediate and unequivocal: total interdiction. Elias ordered the construction of hunter-killer squadrons, coordinated packs of 12 runners, each augmented with dedicated submersible boarding teams and seismic disruption arrays. The objective was absolute: no penetrator platform, intact or partially deployed, would be permitted to link into a Nader formation. The war for the deep had entered its decisive phase. The first confrontation erupted in the Diamantina Fracture Zone, a narrow subsidiary trench feeding into the Java Trench. A Nader assault group, comprising 42 penetrator platforms and 16 escort corvettes, began its descent under a regime of total emissions control. The platforms moved in a staggered helical pattern, their mass drivers pulsing at infrasonic frequencies that defied conventional detection. It was a methodical invasion, designed to infiltrate the trenches undetected and emplace its payload before countermeasures could be brought to bear. Elias commanded the intercept from the Eidolon, leading a squadron that had spent the preceding month positioning itself within the Fracture Zone's interlocking canyon network. The runners lay motionless, their reactors throttled to standby, crews breathing in disciplined silence as the Vorath formation penetrated the outer limits. The enemy's stealth was formidable, but imperfect. The subtle gravitational perturbations of 64 massive cylinders moving in unison created detectable distortions in the local water column, anomalies that the fleet's gravitic sensor arrays salvaged from a captured corvette and painstakingly recalibrated could resolve at 20 kilometers. When the Nader group reached its emplacement threshold, Elias unleashed the squadron. The runners erupted from their concealed positions in a coordinated spiral maneuver, converging on the formation's central axis. Submersible teams deployed in swarms, burrowing into the penetrator's outer hulls with shape-charge cutters and flooding compromised compartments with quick-hardening polymer foam. Simultaneously, Mauler torpedoes targeted the escort corvettes, collapsing canyon walls to isolate the penetrators from mutual support. The Nader platforms responded with programmed ferocity. Their interlinked lattice initiated partial firing sequences, detonating a dozen of their number in controlled bursts that triggered localized seismic events. Walls of sediment and fractured bedrock surged through the narrow confines of the Fracture Zone, crushing 2 runners outright and forcing the remainder to execute desperate evasive dives. Elias felt the shockwave compress the Eidolon's hull, every structural member groaning under loads that approached design limits. Bulkheads buckled in auxiliary compartments. Emergency shoring teams fought to contain propagating fractures as the ocean sought to reclaim its domain, yet the resistance prevailed. 31 penetrators were neutralized, either physically destroyed or neurologically subverted, preventing the formation of a critical cascade. The surviving platforms, isolated and without the distributed lattice necessary to initiate their primary function, self-destructed in fragmented bursts that further choked the canyon system. The Diamantina engagement claimed nearly a quarter of the intercepting squadron. But it demonstrated a fundamental vulnerability. Nader assault groups required intact, synchronized emplacements to achieve their purpose. Sever the lattice, and the platforms were reduced to isolated bombs incapable of coordinated destruction. Word of the victory spread through the fleet, carried on tight beam bursts and the indelible record of acoustic events. For the first time, crews spoke openly of forcing the Vorath to abandon the deep entirely. But Elias saw the deeper implications. Each Nader group committed represented a massive expenditure of resources, industrial capacity that could have been directed toward surface dominance. The enemy was being compelled to wage a campaign of attrition in a domain where their advantages of scale were nullified, where every attempt at eradication demanded a commensurate sacrifice. In the aftermath, Elias walked the length of a repair bay where salvaged penetrator components were being dissected. The scale of the devices was humbling. Each platform housed enough shaped charges to excavate a caldera, coupled with a command intelligence that rivaled the fleet's most advanced runners. As he traced the lattice conduits, a young engineering lieutenant approached, her face streaked with conductive grease. "Captain," she said, gesturing to a partially intact control manifold. "This isn't just a weapon. It's a surveyor." Every platform carries a full-spectrum geophysical model of its target trench. They weren't planning to collapse the deep blindly. They were going to do it surgically. Elias examined the crystalline data lattice, its surface etched with fractal arrays of embedded processors. The realization settled over him like the weight of a descending pressure front. The Vorath were not merely attempting to bury the trenches. They were preparing to reshape the ocean floor according to their own design, deliberate reconfiguration of planetary geology, to ensure that no subsurface sanctuary could ever again exist. In that moment, standing amid the wreckage of machines built to unmake the world's deepest places, Elias felt the full measure of the war's stakes. The trenches were not merely hiding places. They were the last true remnant of an Earth that predated conquest, a primordial expanse that had endured for hundreds of millions of years before any empire claimed the surface. To lose them would be to lose more than mobility or tactical advantage. It would be to erase the final domain where humanity could claim uncompromised sovereignty. He turned from the manifold and looked toward the engineering bay's single observation port, where the trench wall loomed in a shroud of suspended particulates. The deep did not bend to the will of invaders. It crushed them or endured them, indifferent to their ambitions. And in that indifference, Elias perceived something greater than strategy, a vast, unspoken order that had shaped continents and cradled the origins of life. Persisting through every cataclysm that sought to impose itself upon it, the Vorath would come again, with more Nader groups, refined doctrines, and unrelenting commitment. But they would discover that the abyss was not a space to be conquered or reshaped. It was a presence, ancient and absolute, that yielded nothing and forgave no presumption. And from within that presence, the fleet prepared to remind them that some dominions could not be breached without becoming part of the darkness they sought to. The Diamantina victory marked the precipice between skirmish and annihilation. Nader assault groups began to deploy in relentless succession, each formation larger and more ruthlessly optimized than the last. The Vorath abandoned the pretense of stealth, flooding the primary trench systems with waves of penetrator platforms, escort corvettes, and seismic decoupler swarms unmanned, drones designed to neutralize the geological sabotage that had previously disrupted their emplacements. The deep became a battlefield of colliding cataclysms, controlled detonations engineered to fracture, bedrock warring against the ceaseless, indifferent violence of the ocean floor itself. Captain Elias Kane no longer commanded isolated engagements, but orchestrated a campaign of continuous interdiction. The fleet fragmented into permanent strike groups, each assigned a specific trench complex, operating without respite. Runners patrolled the shadowed canyons like packs of abyssal predators, intercepting nadir formations at the precise moment of emplacement. Submersible teams infiltrated penetrator hulls, severing the distributed command lattice that formed the backbone of each assault group's destructive potential. Where subversion was impossible, Mauler torpedoes and seismic disruptors were employed without restraint, collapsing access routes and burying entire formations beneath mobilized sediment. The tempo of operations eroded the fleet's margins to the vanishing point. Hulls accumulated microfractures that could not be fully repaired between sorties. Crews cycled through 16-hour shifts, their bodies sustained by stimpaks, nutrient drips, and the relentless discipline of survival. Losses mounted with the inevitability of collapsing strata. The Nemesis lost its forward pressure sphere to a penetrator's emergency cascade, taking 412 crew into the depths. The Seren's maw was pinned and methodically crushed over 3 days by a coordinated swarm of seismic decouplers. Its final transmission a defiant litany of bulkhead failure warnings. Elias bore the attrition in silence, but it carved visible channels through his command. In the dim confines of his cabin, surrounded by the ceaseless murmur of auxiliary pumps compensating for hull stress, doubt manifested as a tangible adversary. Each destroyed nadir group preserved the trenches for another month, but at the cost of ships and lives that could not be replaced. The fleet's population, once approaching 2 million, had dwindled to 180,000, confined to fewer than 30 operational runners. Fabrication bays operated continuously. Yet raw materials, high-grade composites, iridium catalysts, fault-tolerant superconductors were irrecoverable. Losses once expended at the breaking point arrived during the defense of the Kuril Trench. A nadir formation of 92 penetrators, escorted by 24 corvettes and a central command bastion, penetrated the trench's primary axis and began emplacing in a formation calculated to induce a self-propagating collapse along a 500-kilometer fault line. Elias committed every available Runner 21 vessels, representing 80% of the fleet's remaining strength. The engagement. The battle unfolded as a sustained convulsion of the deep. Runners and submersible teams struck in successive waves, targeting the command bastion while simultaneously severing lattice linkages across the penetrator formation. The Vorath countered with unprecedented ferocity. The bastion released a full complement of seismic decouplers, which detonated in overlapping cascades, triggering spontaneous rockfalls that filled the trench with pulverized basalt and acoustic chaos. 5 runners were destroyed outright, their hulls overwhelmed by converging debris fronts. Elias directed the remaining vessels from the Eidolon, executing a desperate maneuver known as the spine fracture. Every available Mauler torpedo was launched into the trench's central fault line, timed to coincide with the sabotage of the nadir command bastion. The resulting detonation sequence, a chain of precisely synchronized implosions and rockfalls, shattered the penetrator formation before it could achieve critical mass. 68 platforms were entombed in their own collapse, their command lattice irrecoverably severed. The surviving corvettes withdrew, trailing debris and crippled drives, but victory came at a price that stripped the fleet to its foundations. 12 runners were lost, more than half the committed force, including the Abyssal Crown, which suffered a total structural cascade and vanished from sonar in less than 40 seconds. The Eidolon itself sustained critical damage, a propagating fracture through its primary pressure sphere that required the permanent evacuation of 4 decks and the installation of an experimental internal shoring lattice. Casualties exceeded 14,000. Reducing the fleet's operational capacity to a shadow of its former strength. In the aftermath, Elias convened the surviving captains in the Eidolon's auxiliary command sphere, a cramped chamber ringed with emergency bulkheads and flickering damage control readouts. The faces before him were hollowed by exhaustion and loss, their eyes reflecting the knowledge that the fleet had survived its greatest battle by expending the greater part of its reserves. "We cannot continue this way," Commander Vos stated without preamble. One more engagement of that scale, and there will be nothing left to fight with. We have proven we can stop them, but at the cost of becoming ghosts ourselves. The chamber filled with a silence as heavy as crush depth. For the first time, no counter-arguments were offered. The unspoken truth pressed against every bulkhead. The fleet had reached the limits of attrition. To continue fighting Nader groups with the same ferocity would result in self-inflicted annihilation. Elias stood at the central plot table. The holographic display showing a fleet reduced to scattered fragments, their positions marked by pulsing warning icons. Then we stopped fighting their war, he said. We forced them to fight ours. The decision that followed marked the end of reactive interdiction and the beginning of a strategy rooted in the immutable nature of the abyss. Rather than contesting every Nader deployment, the fleet would withdraw to a series of deliberately selected redoubts, narrow, geologically unstable trench complexes where the Vorath would be compelled to commit their full strength. Within these kill boxes, every defensive asset would be concentrated: layered minefields, seismic denial arrays, towed acoustic disruptors, and every remaining boarding team. The objective was not merely to destroy the Nader groups, but to demonstrate that any attempt to force the deep would result in the permanent loss of every asset committed. It was a strategy of absolute denial, predicated on a single unyielding truth: the Vorath could not afford to lose what humanity had already sacrificed. They possessed the industrial capacity to replace ships and penetrators, but the trenches themselves could not be replaced. Every Nader formation destroyed within a kill box would leave behind a permanent obstruction, debris fields, and collapsed canyons. That would require decades and unimaginable resources to clear. As the fleet dispersed toward its designated redoubts, Elias stood alone in the observation blister, watching particulate clouds drift past the armored glass. The Kuril Trench lay in ruins, a fractured testament to the cost of survival. In the silence between hull creaks, he considered the men and women who had followed him into the dark, expending their lives to hold a realm that offered no sunlight, no horizon, no reprieve. Survival, he realized, was not defined by the absence of loss, but by the refusal to relinquish what could not be replaced. The deep had cradled life since the formation of the planet, indifferent to the empires that rose and shattered on its surface. It would endure beyond the war, beyond the combatants, as it always had. And in that endurance lay the final measure of defiance. For the first time in years, Elias spoke into the unrelenting dark. They can bury our ships and fill our canyons with debris, but they cannot bury the ocean. And they cannot bury what lives within it. The abyss made no reply. But in its vast, unblinking silence, the certainty grew that some domains were not possessions to be won or lost, but constants that claimed all who sought to command them. Destroy. The fleet withdrew into the heart of its chosen sanctuaries, abandoning the open expanses of the major trench systems and consolidating within a network of deliberately selected kill boxes. These were not the broad, navigable canyons that had once allowed the runners to evade and strike at will, but narrower, more unforgiving passages, subduction scarps, and fault-bounded basins where the geology itself amplified destruction. The Mariana Fracture Zone, the Romanche Rise, the Vima Fracture, places where the ocean floor seemed poised on the edge of rupture, where every seismic event propagated with the inevitability of a breaking bone. Captain Elias Kane orchestrated the transformation of these redoubts into instruments of annihilation. Every surviving runner was stripped of non-essential systems and reconfigured for static defense. Hulls were wedded to the trench walls, their outer structures laced with ablative foam and shoring struts to distribute compressive loads. Thousands of mines, supercavitating warheads, seismic disruptors, and variable buoyancy demolition charges were sown in concentric fields. Their activation triggers interlocked to ensure that any intrusion would provoke a cascading collapse. Submersible teams laced the canyon walls with sensor-studded breaching charges, transforming the geological instability of the deep into a symphony of programmed destruction. The crews understood the implications of this entrenchment without being told. By committing to the redoubts, they were relinquishing the mobility that had defined their survival for 2 decades. Once engaged, there would be no retreat. The fleet would either repel the Vorath incursion or be crushed within the collapsing walls of its own defenses. Elias walked the length of the Eidolon as it fused to its berth in the Mariana's deepest alcove, observing the methodical process of becoming part of the stone. Crews worked in silence, sealing compartments that would never again be traversed, welding auxiliary pressure spheres into the trench wall itself, and committing their lives to a fortress that offered no escape. The Vorath came in the full measure of their commitment. 5 Nader assault groups, 412 penetrator platforms, 48 corvettes, and 3 command bastions descended upon the Mariana Fracture Zone in a formation designed to overwhelm any conceivable defense. The scale of the operation was unprecedented. The penetrators spread across a front of nearly 600 kilometers, their mass drivers pulsing in unison to force every access point simultaneously. Seismic decouplers swarmed ahead of the formation, attempting to neutralize the canyon walls before the platforms could be engaged. Elias watched the approach from the command sphere, the bathyplot filled with the interlocking signatures of the invading force. When the lead elements crossed the outer mine fields, he gave the order to close the trap. The response was annihilation on a scale that defied containment. Every mine in the outer perimeter detonated in a precisely sequenced cascade, timed to exploit the fracture zone's natural stress concentrations. The resulting collapse did not manifest as discrete explosions, but as a continuous seismic event, a chain reaction of fault ruptures that mobilized over 1 billion tons of fractured bedrock. Canyon walls sheared away in kilometer-wide slabs, sweeping through the Nader formation like the blades of some subterranean reaper. Penetrator platforms, their hulls designed to withstand focused implosions, were obliterated by the unresisting mass of collapsing mountains. Corvettes attempting to withdraw were pinned between converging debris fronts and systematically crushed, their pressure spheres rupturing in a protracted requiem of thunderous implosions. The command bastions fought to maintain coherence, releasing their full complement of decouplers and initiating emergency cascades within their own formations. The desperate stratagem succeeded only in accelerating their destruction. The detonations of nearly 200 penetrators intended to fracture the redoubt from within triggered secondary collapses that buried the remainder of the assault force. Within 12 hours, the Mariana Fracture Zone had become a sealed tomb, its primary axis choked with pulverized stone and the wreckage of 412 penetrator platforms. The cost of the fleet was absolute. 8 runners were lost entirely, their hulls overwhelmed by the very collapses they had initiated. The Eidolon survived with its primary sphere intact, but 5 secondary compartments were permanently sealed, their bulkheads buckled beyond repair. Casualties exceeded 20,000, nearly 1 in 8 of the fleet's remaining population. Yet the redoubt had held. The Vorath had committed their largest ever deep-water offensive and suffered losses that could not be rebuilt within a human lifetime. In the aftermath, silence reigned across every acoustic channel. The Vorath did not return. Probes ceased deployment. Sensor buoys went unanswered. For 6 months, the ocean depths remained undisturbed. The surviving redoubts, standing as mute sentinels amid the rubble of their defense, Elias moved through the Eidolon's surviving compartments, where repair crews worked ceaselessly to shore up fractures and redistribute life support to habitable volumes. The ship, once a swift predator of the abyss, was now a crippled bastion, its mobility sacrificed to the necessity of survival. He found Commander Voss in a repair bay, supervising the extraction of a damaged power bus from a flooded auxiliary sphere. Her face, scarred by a pressure rupture that had nearly claimed her right arm, carried the weight of a victory purchased at the brink of extinction. "They won't come back," she said without preamble. "Not here. Not after Mariana." "They may not need to," Ilias replied. "We've sealed ourselves inside our own defenses. We can hold the deep, but we cannot leave it." Voss met his gaze without flinching. "Then what was it all for?" "To prove that we can kill ourselves as effectively as they can." The question cut through the accumulated layers of strategy and sacrifice. Ilias had no immediate answer. The fleet had demonstrated that the deep could not be taken by force, that any attempt to eradicate its inhabitants would result in mutual annihilation. But in doing so, they had transformed themselves from elusive raiders into immured defenders, their existence confined to a handful of scarred redoubts. That night, standing before the sole remaining observation port, Ilias watched particulate clouds swirl through the debris-choked trench. The water beyond the armored glass was darker than it had ever been, lightless even by the standards of the abyss. In that unrelenting void, a certainty took shape. The Vorath had been taught a fundamental truth. The deep could not be conquered without becoming its prisoner. But humanity still required more than survival within a cage of its own making. The lesson of the redoubts was not merely defensive. It was the foundation for a counterstroke. The enemy now understood the price of forcing the depths. It was time to make them understand that the price of denying the depths was equally unacceptable. Ilias turned from the port, the decision coalescing with the clarity of a hull breach sealed in extremis. The fleet would not remain immured forever. When the moment came, they would rise not as scattered raiders, but as a single indivisible force. The ocean would not merely deny the Vorath. It would expel them, and in the silence that followed the cataclysm of Mariana, the first preparations for that ascension began. Deep within the shattered canyons, where the wreckage of 400 penetrator platforms lay entombed, salvage teams began to extract the components of a weapon that would transform defense into dominion. The abyss had been held. Now it would strike back. The redoubts stood as shattered monuments to survival, their labyrinthine passages choked with the pulverized remains of the Nader assault groups. Amid the debris fields where the wreckage of 400 penetrator platforms lay entombed beneath collapsed canyon walls, the fleet began a labor that transcended mere repair. Salvage teams, working in the suspended particulate clouds of the Mariana Fracture Zone, extracted the heart of the enemy's failed offensive. The command lattice that had once synchronized. Cascades of tectonic destruction. These lattices were not mere controlled networks but distributed intelligences of exquisite complexity, quantum entangled. Arrays capable of coordinating multi-stage seismic events across hundreds of kilometers. Intact, they would have unmade the deep, dissected and reprogrammed. They became the foundation of humanity's COUNTERST. RKE. Captain Ilias Kane directed the creation of what would become known as the Ascendant Array. Hundreds of salvaged lattice cores, stripped from their shattered housings and integrated into the fleet's remaining runners, were fused into a single planet-spanning command manifold. The array did not merely link the surviving vessels. It transformed them into components of a singular entity, capable of synchronizing their actions with the precision of a single heartbeat. Every hydrophone, every structural sensor, every seismic transducer within the redoubts was woven into a neural architecture that encompassed the entire oceanic domain. The transformation was as much human as it was mechanical. Crews relinquished individual command autonomy, subordinating their runners to the collective calculus of the array. Ilias himself surrendered direct control of the Eidolon, allowing its systems to merge with the greater whole. The act required a faith bordering on surrender, to entrust the survival of every soul aboard, every vessel to a machine intelligence forged from the wreckage of the enemy's most devastating weapon. As the array took form, Elias walked the shadowed repair bays where technicians grafted, captured lattice cores into the hulls of ships that had been welded to the trench walls. The work was conducted in near silence, punctuated only by the hiss of hydraulic seals and the low thrum of power buses rerouting through unfamiliar conduits. He paused before a partially integrated core, its crystalline facets pulsing with the faint blue of contained computation. A systems chief, her hands blackened by conductive residue, looked up from her work. "It's ready to link," she said. "But once it does, there's no pulling it apart. Every ship becomes part of the same mind." "If it fails, it won't fail," Elias replied, though the possibility lingered in the spaces between his words. The array was a gamble born of necessity, a weapon that demanded the fleet sacrifice its independence to achieve unity. He understood the fear that shadowed every connection, that in becoming one, they might lose what made them human. The decision to activate came without ceremony. In the command sphere of the Eidolon, Elias initiated the final synchronization. Across the redoubts, 31 runners, each a crippled fortress, fused to the bones of the deep linked into the ascendant array. The moment of convergence registered not as a discrete event, but as a gradual emergence. The sudden clarity of 1,000 disparate sensor feeds resolving into a single coherent awareness. The fleet no longer operated as a collection of independent vessels, but as an extension of the ocean itself, its movements guided by a distributed intelligence that comprehended every current, every acoustic shadow, every fault line within its domain. The array's first action was not assault, but revelation. It mapped the full extent of the damage inflicted during the redoubt defenses, canyon systems reduced to rubble, access routes permanently sealed, entire subsidiary trenches filled with debris that would require centuries to disperse. Yet within that devastation, the array identified pathways narrow, previously unmapped fissures and pressure-equalized voids that could be exploited for coordinated emergence. The fleet would not claw its way through the rubble. It would flow through it, a single organism navigating the fractures of its own battlefield. The Vorath returned after 14 months of silence, compelled by the intolerable uncertainty of an enemy that could neither be located nor destroyed. A massive consolidation fleet, 200 freighters carrying prefabricated deep-water bastions, supported by 50 corvettes, and an unprecedented deployment of autonomous platforms descended upon the fractured Mariana system. Their intent was unambiguous: to excavate the redoubts, recover the lost penetrators, and impose a permanent exclusion zone upon the ruins. The array responded without hesitation. The redoubts did not rise as individual vessels, but as a coordinated surge. 31 runners, synchronized to microsecond precision, detached from their moorings and poured into the constricted channels of the debris field. They did not advance as a conventional formation, but as a propagating wave, exploiting transient pressure gradients and seismic microfractures to bypass obstacles that would have trapped any solitary ship. The array orchestrated their movements through the chaos with flawless economy, transforming the rubble-choked trenches into conduits for coordinated attack. The assault unfolded with the inevitability of an undersea avalanche. Runners emerged from concealed fissures to sever the supply lines of the consolidation fleet, targeting freighters and their escorts with surgical bursts of torpedoes. Simultaneously, the array triggered a series of precisely calibrated seismic pulses, detonations drawn from salvaged penetrator warheads along the fault lines bordering the enemy formation. The resulting collapses did not merely destroy. They isolated, surrounding entire segments of the fleet with walls of mobilized bedrock. Vorath corvettes and autonomous platforms fought with desperate ferocity. But the array's coordination proved insurmountable. Every countermeasure was anticipated, every maneuver enveloped by attacks launched from multiple, mutually supporting vectors. Freighters were systematically crippled and pinned, their cargoes of bastion components buried beneath controlled rockfalls. Within 3 days, The consolidation fleet had been reduced to scattered remnants, trapped in debris fields from which no organized retreat was possible. Elias stood in the command sphere, observing the tactical display where the enemy formation fragmented under the relentless precision of the array. For the first time since the fall of the surface, humanity held the strategic initiative. The Vorath had been defeated not through superior firepower or numbers, but through a unity of purpose that turned the inherent hostility of the deep into an extension of their will. As the final corvettes succumbed to coordinated implosions, Elias understood the true significance of the victory. The ocean had been held, defended, and now wielded as a weapon. The Vorath had learned that the abyss could not be conquered by force, nor denied by destruction. What remained was to demonstrate that it could not be ignored. In the silence that followed the annihilation of the consolidation fleet, Elias spoke to the assembled captains, their images projected across the linked network of the array. They came to bury us. They have filled the deep with their wreckage. Now we will show them that the sea does not remain buried. The fleet prepared to ascend, not as fugitive raiders, nor as immured defenders, but as the masters of a domain that had never truly been relinquished. The surface waited, held by an enemy who had never comprehended the price of claiming a world without possessing its depths. And in the shadowed canyons, where the bones of their failed conquests lay crushed and silent, the waters began to rise.